the Luthier's Silent Strings, a rhythmic sleep story of care and repair. The January cold pressed against the windows of the old house like something with weight and intention, but down in the basement workshop, warmth pooled in the corners and gathered beneath the rafters. The luthier paused at the top of the wooden stairs, one hand on the rail, feeling the particular heaviness that had been following them around for weeks, now maybe months, if they were being honest with themselves. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that announced itself loudly. It was more like a gradual accumulation, like dust settling on furniture you forgot to use, like strings going slack on an instrument left too long in its case. They descended the stairs slowly, each step releasing a small creak that had become as familiar as breathing. 13 steps. They decounted them thousands of times over the years, ever since their grandmother had first brought them down here as a child, when the workshop had seemed cavernous and mysterious, full of strange tools with curved edges and wood shavings that curled like ribbon. The workshop revealed itself in layers as they reached the bottom and moved through the space, switching on lamps one by one. Each lamp had an amber-toned bulb that cast everything in warm honey light, softening the edges of workbenches and the angles of tools hanging on pegboards. The old radiator in the corner hissed its gentle greeting, a sound that meant winter and safety and being exactly where you belonged. The air smelled the way it always did: aged wood and varnish, lemon oil and something else, something almost sweet, like the memory of rosin dust suspended in time. Shelves lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling, organized with the kind of care that spoke of decades of practice. Glass jars held wood shavings, sorted by type, maple, spruce, ebony, each one labeled in their grandmother's careful handwriting, labels that had yellowed but remained perfectly legible. There were boxes of bridges in various stages of completion, packets of strings arranged by gauge and purpose, small envelopes of peg compound, bottles of varnish in shades from amber to deep burgundy. Everything had its place, everything had purpose, everything except the luthier themselves lately. They stood for a moment in the center of the workshop, hands in the pockets of their wool cardigan, aware of how tired they felt. Not the good kind of tired that comes from a full day of meaningful work, but the tired that seeps into your bones when you've been moving too fast for too long, saying yes when you mean no, pouring yourself out for everyone else's music while your own voice grows quieter and quieter, until one day you realize you can't remember the last time you sang. Near the radiator, on a folded wool blanket that had once been hunter green, but had faded to something softer, gentler, a calico cat raised her head and opened one golden eye. Fiddle. She'd shown up at the back door 4 years ago, scrawny and suspicious, and had eventually decided that the workshop was an acceptable domain. She stretched now with the luxurious slowness of the deeply comfortable, extending her front paws until they trembled slightly, her back arching, her mouth opening in a silent yawn that showed all her small, sharp teeth. Then she resettled on her blanket, tucked her paws beneath her chest, and watched the luthier with that particular cat expression that seemed to ask, "Well, are you going to do something interesting, or should I go back to sleep?" "I know," the luthier said softly to Fiddle. "I've been putting it off." They moved to the far corner of the workshop, where the cello case waited. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, brought by a woman in her 60s who had inherited it from an aunt. The aunt had been a music teacher, the woman explained, but arthritis had forced her to stop playing in her 40s. She'd kept the cello for decades after that, moving it from house to house, unable to part with it, but unable to play it either. "I think she'd want someone to make it sing again," the woman had said, running her hand over the worn case. "I think she'd want it to have another life." The luthier had taken the case, had promised to assess the instrument, had set it in the corner, and then had proceeded to work on every other project in the shop. A violin that needed a soundpost adjustment, a viola with a cracked rib, a double bass that needed new strings. Anything but the cello. Anything but the instrument that had sat silent in darkness for 37 years, waiting. But tonight the workshop felt different. The snow falling outside the small basement window made the warm space feel even more like a haven, and the quiet, the deep middle of winter quiet that came when the world was muffled and still felt like permission somehow. Permission to slow down. Permission to sit with something that would take time. The luthier lifted the case and carried it to the main workbench, a broad surface of maple that had been their grandmother's and her father's before that, worn smooth by decades of hands and tools and careful attention. They set the case down gently and stood looking at it for a moment, at the worn black leather handle and the tarnished brass latches. Then they opened it. The smell that emerged was immediate and complex dust and old velvet, the particular mustiness of something locked away from air and light for too long, and underneath it all, the scent of aged wood. The interior of the case was lined with burgundy velvet that had faded to mauve in places, worn thin where the neck of the cello had rested. The instrument itself lay cradled in its fitted space, and even before touching it, the luthier could see the passage of time written across its surface. They reached in carefully, sliding their hands beneath the body and neck, and lifted. The cello was heavier than it looked, good, dense wood, probably European spruce for the top and maple for the back and sides. As it emerged into the lamplight, its beauty became apparent despite the decades of neglect. The varnish had darkened with age to a deep amber orange, and there were fine cracks in the finish that mapped across the surface like river deltas viewed from a great height, each crack telling a story of humidity changes, of seasons cycling past, of time itself written in lines too small to see unless you looked closely. The luthier turned the cello slowly, examining it from every angle. The scroll at the top was carved with elegant lines, traditional, but with a slight flourish that suggested the original maker had taken pride in the work. The peg box held 4 ebony pegs, and when the luthier tested them gently, they barely moved, frozen in place by decades of stillness, by rosin dust and humidity and the simple fact of not being used. The strings themselves were ancient, discolored to a dull gray-brown, brittle-looking, with that fragile quality that meant they'd snap at the slightest provocation. The luthier carried the cello to the padded workbench, where instruments waited for careful hands, and set it down on its side. From this angle, the light caught the flame figure in the maple of the back, those beautiful irregular patterns in the wood grain that looked like fire frozen in amber. Someone had chosen this wood carefully. Someone had loved this instrument in its making. The luthier felt something catch in their chest, a sensation like recognition. They traced one finger along the edge of the cello's body, feeling the slight ridge where the purfling was inlaid, those thin strips of wood that protected the edge and added a decorative border. The wood was cool to the touch, but not cold. It had been waiting in this room for 3 weeks, coming slowly to room temperature, to the humidity of the workshop, preparing itself without knowing it was preparing for this moment of attention. When did I stop playing? The luthier thought suddenly. Not just other people's instruments, but my own. When did I put down my violin and forget to pick it up again? It had been gradual, like so many disappearances. First, they'd been too busy, too many repairs coming in, too many people needing their instruments ready for performances, for auditions, for students starting lessons. Then it had been too late at night. I'll play tomorrow, they'd told themselves. Tomorrow when I'm less tired. And then tomorrow would come and there would be another reason, another excuse. And eventually they'd stopped even thinking about it. Their own violin sat in its case in the corner of the workshop, probably out of tune by now, probably wondering why it had been abandoned. Just like this cello had wondered, perhaps, in whatever way instruments wonder about such things. Sitting in darkness, strings going slack, gathering dust, waiting for hands that never came. "Okay," the luthier said softly, speaking to the cello, to the workshop, to themselves. "Let's see what we're working with." They reached for their jeweler's loupe, a small magnifying lens that fit over one eye, and began the careful work of assessment. Starting at the scroll, they examined every inch of the instrument, looking for cracks in the wood, for open seams, for any sign of structural damage that would need to be addressed before the cello could be safely strung and tuned. The peg box was solid. The fingerboard, ebony worn smooth by years of fingers pressing strings against it, was intact, though it would need oil. The neck joint where the neck met the body was secure. Moving down the body, the luthier checked each rib, each corner block, running their fingers along the seams and feeling for any looseness, any give that would indicate the glue had failed. Everything was fundamentally sound. The bones were good, as their grandmother used to say. This was an instrument that had been well made, and for most of its life, well cared for. It wasn't neglect that had silenced it, but circumstance arthritis that had taken away the player's ability to press strings, to draw a bow, to make music despite the desire still living in the heart. The luthier understood that, too. Sometimes the silence wasn't about not wanting to sing. Sometimes it was about life getting in the way, about hands getting tired, about the world being loud and demanding, and leaving no room for the quiet thing you used to love. They removed the loop and reached for a small mirror on a flexible wand, a tool designed for looking inside an instrument through the EFA holes, those elegant curved openings cut into the top of the cello. They angled a penlight and peered through the mirror, examining the interior. The blocks looked secure. The linings, thin strips of wood glued inside to reinforce the seams, were intact. And there, standing upright between the top and the back, wedged in place by careful pressure alone, was the soundpost. The soundpost was perhaps the most crucial element of a stringed instrument's voice. It looked like nothing, just a small cylinder of spruce, fitted precisely between the front and back plates of the instrument beneath the treble foot of the bridge. But its position, its exact placement, could transform an instrument's tone from dull to brilliant, from harsh to sweet. It carried vibrations from the top to the back, creating the complex resonances that made a cello sound like a cello, and not just a wooden box with strings stretched across it. The luthier's grandmother had called it the soul of the instrument. Without the soundpost, she'd said, you just have pretty carpentry. With it, you have music. The soundpost in this cello had shifted slightly over the years. The luthier could see that even through the small mirror. It was leaning just a bit, no longer standing perpendicular as it should. That would need to be adjusted before the instrument could be properly voiced. But like everything else, it could wait until the basic work was done. First things first, the cello needed to be cleaned, the old strings removed, the bridge assessed, the pegs made functional again. The luthier set down the mirror and penlight and reached for a soft cloth and a small bottle of lemon oil mixed with just a touch of mineral spirit, a formula their grandmother had taught them, gentle enough not to damage old varnish but effective at cleaning away decades of accumulated dust and the sticky residue that came from rosin dust settling on an instrument that had been wiped down after playing. They poured a small amount of the mixture onto the cloth, just enough to dampen it, and began to work. Starting at the scroll, they moved the cloth in small circles, working gradually down the neck, across the body, following the curve of the ribs around to the back. The rhythm was meditative: circle, wipe, move, circle, wipe, move. And as they worked, the wood began to respond. The varnish started to glow. Underneath the grime and dust, the amber-orange color deepened and warmed, and the flame figure in the maple seemed to move in the lamplight, those frozen fire patterns shifting as the angle changed. The spruce of the top revealed its tight, even grain, the kind of old-growth wood that was increasingly rare, cut from trees that had grown slowly in cold climates, developing the density and resonance that makers prized. Shuck, shuck, went the cloth against the varnish, a soft rhythmic sound that filled the workshop. Shuck, 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 shuck. The luthier found their breathing slowing to match the rhythm, their shoulders dropping slightly, the tight knot that had taken up residence between their shoulder blades beginning, just barely, to loosen. This was the part of the work they'd forgotten they loved. Not the dramatic moments, the first sound from a restored instrument, the grateful tears of a musician reunited with a repaired treasure, but these quiet moments of attention, the simple act of caring for something that couldn't care for itself, the meditation of repetitive motion done with skill and intention. When had they stopped caring for themselves with this kind of attention? When had they started rushing through showers, eating, standing up at the kitchen counter, falling asleep to podcasts, because silence felt too empty? When had slowness become something to apologize for instead of something to savor? Behind them there was a soft thump as Fiddle jumped down from her blanket and padded across the workshop floor. The luthier felt the cat as presence before they saw her, that particular warmth that came from a small furred creature, deciding you were worth investigating. Fiddle hopped up onto a stool beside the workbench and then onto the bench itself, moving with the careful precision that cats employed when navigating spaces full of delicate objects. She approached the open cello case and stopped, whiskers forward, nose twitching. She sniffed the burgundy velvet lining with great thoroughness, as if conducting her own assessment of the situation. Then, apparently satisfied that the case posed no threat, she stepped inside and turned around 3 times before settling down, curling into a perfect spiral of calico fur in the exact spot where the celloist's body had rested for 37 years. The luthier smiled, the first real smile they'd managed in days. "That's not for you," they said mildly, but made no move to displace the cat. Fiddle blinked slowly, the cat equivalent of a shrug, and tucked her nose under her tail. The luthier returned to their work. By the time they'd finished cleaning the entire instrument, nearly an hour had passed. The workshop had grown even warmer, the radiator clanking occasionally as it did its work, and outside the window, the snow continued to fall in that silent, steady way that suggested it would continue all night, transforming the world into something clean and quiet and new. The cello gleamed in the lamplight, and the luthier stepped back to look at it properly for the first time. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful, but now that beauty was visible again, no longer hidden under layers of neglect. The wood seemed almost alive, the varnish catching and reflecting light in complex ways, the grain patterns telling their silent stories. But it was still silent, still out of tune, still waiting. The luthier washed their hands at the small sink in the corner of the workshop. Cold water, unscented soap, dried on a clean towel, and returned to the workbench. Now came the careful work of removing the old strings. They started with the A string, the highest pitched of the 4 strings. The peg that held it had been turned tight 37 years ago and hadn't moved since. The luthier gripped it carefully, applying gentle inward pressure while simultaneously trying to turn it counterclockwise. At first, nothing happened. The peg might as well have been glued in place. "Patience," the luthier murmured, remembering their grandmother's voice saying the same thing. The wood remembers. You just have to remind it how to move. They reached for a small cake of peg compound, a mixture of fine abrasives and lubricants that looked something like hard soap. They pulled the peg out just slightly, applied a tiny amount of compound to the shaft, and pushed it back in. Then they tried again, rocking the peg gently back and forth, clockwise and counterclockwise, feeling for the moment when the wood would release its grip. There, a tiny movement, then more. The peg began to turn, and as it did, the tension on the string decreased. The ancient string went from tight to loose to hanging slack, and when all tension was released, the luthier carefully unwound it from the peg and pulled it free. The string came away in their hand brittle, discolored, its wrapping coming loose in places. It had given its service and was now retired. One by one, the luthier repeated the process with each string, the D string, the G string. Finally, the C string, the lowest and thickest, wound with silver that had tarnished to dark gray. Each peg fought at first and then surrendered, remembering after all these years how to do the work it was made for. Each string released with a soft ping as the last tension gave way, a sound like a tiny exhalation, like relief. As the luthier worked, they thought about tension, about how they'd been holding it in their own body, shoulders up around their ears, jaw clenched, chest tight with a kind of chronic low-level anxiety that had become so familiar they barely noticed it anymore. They'd been wound too tight in some ways, too loose in others, like strings that had never been properly adjusted, never been given the attention and care needed to find the right pitch. When all 4 strings were off, the cello looked naked, vulnerable. The bridge, the small curved piece of maple that stood upright on the top of the instrument, holding the strings up and away from the body, no longer had anything to hold. The luthier lifted it carefully and examined it in the light. The bridge had warped. Not dramatically, but enough. Over decades of holding tension and then losing it of humidity changes and temperature fluctuations, the wood had developed a slight backward lean, a curve that would muffle the sound and make it impossible to adjust the string height properly. This bridge would need to be replaced. The luthier set the old bridge aside. They never threw away the old parts, even the ones that couldn't be reused, because sometimes a client wanted to see what had been replaced, wanted that tangible proof of the work that had been done, and turned their attention to the soundpost. This was delicate work. The soundpost setter looked like a thin wand made of metal with a bent tip. almost like a crochet hook, but finer. The luthier inserted it through the F-hole, maneuvering carefully, and touched the end to the top of the soundpost. With tiny, precise adjustments, they began to reposition it, checking constantly through the mirror to see the effect, feeling through the wood for the subtle changes in resonance that indicated the post was moving toward its ideal position. It took 15 minutes of minute adjustments, a nudge forward, a tiny push to the left, a microscopic shift back before the soundpost stood exactly where it should, perpendicular to both the top and the back position just behind the treble foot of where the new bridge would stand. The luthier withdrew the setter and checked one more time with the mirror. Perfect. They straightened up, stretching their back, feeling the small pops of vertebrae realigning. Fiddle had emerged from the case at some point and was now sitting on the corner of the workbench, grooming her paw with great concentration, occasionally pausing to look at the luthier, as if checking to make sure they were still doing acceptable work. "What do you think?" the luthier asked the cat. "Are we getting somewhere?" Fiddle yawned, showing no particular opinion on the matter, and returned to her grooming. The luthier smiled again. There was something grounding about the cat's presence, about her complete lack of concern for deadlines or productivity, or any of the anxieties that filled up human days. Fiddle existed in the present moment with absolute commitment. She was here, in this workshop, on this workbench, and that was enough. She didn't carry the weight of yesterday or the worry of tomorrow. She just was. When had the luthier forgotten how to be like that? When had every moment become layered with thoughts of what came next, what still needed doing, what they hadn't done yet, what they should have done better? They turned back to the cello. Next came the bridge. The luthier moved to a different section of the workshop where partially finished bridges stood in rows inside a wooden box, organized by size and purpose. They selected one appropriate for a cello, a blank of aged maple, cut to the rough shape but not yet fitted to this specific instrument. Each bridge needed to be custom fitted because every instrument was slightly different, the arch of the top varying by fractions of millimeters that made all the difference in how the bridge stood and how the sound transferred. The luthier returned to the workbench with the bridge blank and a set of small files, each one shaped for a specific task. This part of the work required intense focus and frequent checking filing a bit from the feet of the bridge, testing the fit against the curve of the cello's top, filing more, testing again. Too much pressure and the bridge would press too hard, damping the vibration. Too little and it would sit loosely, rattling and buzzing. It needed to meet the wood with kiss-soft contact across the entire surface of both feet simultaneously. The only sounds in the workshop were the soft whisper of file against wood, the occasional hiss of the radiator, the rhythmic purring of fiddle, and outside, the absolute silence of falling snow. The luthier lost track of time, entering that state of flow where nothing existed except the work, the wood, the incremental progress toward a goal that could be felt through fingertips and seen in the perfect marriage of bridge foot to cello top. When it was right, and the luthier knew it was right with a certainty that came from years of practice, they set the bridge in position and stepped back. It stood upright, centered between the F-holes, perfectly aligned. Without strings to hold it in place, the slightest vibration would knock it over, but for now, it stood ready, waiting. The luthier checked their watch, an old mechanical one that had been their grandmother's with a leather strap worn, soft as cloth, and was surprised to find that nearly 3 hours had passed. since they descended the stairs into the workshop. It was past 11 o'clock now, and the house above them had settled into its night-time creaks and sighs, the old wood contracting in the cold, the furnace cycling on and off, all the familiar sounds of a house at rest. They should be tired. They'd been tired when they came down here, but instead they felt something else, a kind of alertness, a presence in their body that had been missing for weeks. Their hands were steady. Their breathing was deep and even. The knot between their shoulder blades had loosened enough that they could roll their shoulders without wincing. This was what they'd been missing. Not rest exactly, but this kind of active meditation, this purposeful slowness, this attention paid to something outside themselves, which paradoxically brought them back into themselves, back into their body, back into the present moment where fiddle purred and snow fell and beautiful things waited to be restored. The luthier moved to another shelf and selected 4 new strings, still in their paper sleeves. They'd chosen them specifically when the cello first arrived, based on the instrument's size and probable voice. Not the brightest strings available, this cello didn't want to be bright and brilliant. It wanted to be warm, deep, resonant, the kind of voice that filled a room not with sparkle but with presence, with the kind of sound you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. They laid the strings out on the workbench in order C, G, D, A, the lowest to the highest, the foundation to the voice. Each one was still coiled, held in its paper sleeve, waiting. The C and G strings were wound core of gut, or synthetic material, wrapped with fine silver wire to add mass and depth. The D and A were lighter, thinner, their wrapping creating a different kind of resonance. The luthier picked up the C string and carefully removed it from its sleeve. The string uncurled slowly, remembering its spiral, and they straightened it carefully, feeling its weight, its potential. This string hadn't existed a few months ago. It had been made recently, specifically to replace strings just like the ones they'd removed, ancient, brittle things that had outlived their voice. New strings aren't cheap. The luthier knew that intimately. They placed orders for strings every month, stocking the workshop with different gauges and brands for the various instruments that came through. The set in their hands represented a not insignificant investment, but they were necessary. There was no way to make music with broken strings, with strings that had gone silent. What have I been too frugal with when it comes to myself? The luthier thought suddenly. What necessities have I convinced myself are luxuries? Therapy appointments they'd canceled because they were too busy, too tired, too whatever. The gym membership they'd let lapse. The art class they'd thought about taking, but never signed up for because it seemed like an indulgence. The phone calls to friends they didn't make because they didn't want to burden anyone with their vague malaise, their inability to articulate what was wrong because nothing was dramatically wrong, just off, out of tune. When had taking care of themselves become something they needed to justify? When had the basic maintenance of their own well-being become negotiable? The luthier shook their head slightly, pushing the thoughts away for now, and focused on the work at hand. They threaded the ball end of the C string through the hole in the tailpiece, the piece of ebony at the bottom of the cello that anchored all the strings. The string slid through smoothly, and they brought it up over the bridge, along the fingerboard, and into the peg box. This was where the real work began. They inserted the straight end of the string into the hole drilled through the C peg, the largest of the 4 pegs, positioned on the left side of the peg box, and began to wind. The peg turned in their hands, and slowly the string began to coil around it. Not too tight yet, just enough to hold, just enough to begin creating tension. The peg creaked as it turned. After decades of stillness, the wood was remembering how to work the peg compound, helping it find its grip. The luthier pushed the peg in slightly as they turned it. That was the key to making pegs work properly. Simultaneous turning and inward pressure, creating friction that would hold the peg in place once the string was tensioned. They repeated the process with the G string, then the D, then the A. 4 strings, each one threaded and wound, each peg protesting slightly at first, and then settling into its work. The luthier's hands moved with practiced certainty, even though it had been months since they'd done a complete restringing. The body remembered what the mind might forget. As each string was wound onto its peg, a transformation began. The cello, which had looked naked and vulnerable without strings, was slowly being dressed again, being given back the elements that would allow it to sing. The strings hung loose still, barely touching the bridge, creating no sound yet, but they were there, present, ready. The luthier paused and flexed their fingers. They were moving slowly, breathing deeply, and it felt right. It felt like the opposite of how they'd been living lately, always rushing, always trying to fit one more thing in, always eating lunch while answering emails, always showering too quickly, always falling asleep to noise instead of silence because silence felt too much like being alone with themselves and their thoughts. When had slowness become something to apologize for? When had taking time become laziness instead of wisdom? Their grandmother used to say that you couldn't rush good work. The wood will tell you how fast to go, she'd say. And if you're listening properly, it's always slower than you think. The luthier realized they hadn't been listening. Not to wood, not to their own body, not to the quiet voice that had been trying to tell them for months that they needed to stop, to rest, to tune themselves before they broke something important. But now they were listening, and the message was clear. Slow down, pay attention. You're not broken, but you are out of tune, and tuning takes time and patience and gentle hands. With all 4 strings in place, the luthier reached for their tuning fork. It was a beautiful thing, this forked solid steel, perfectly balanced, made to vibrate at exactly 440 hertz, the standard A note that orchestras used to tune. It had been in the family for 3 generations, passed down from luthier to luthier, and its tone was pure and clear and perfect. The luthier tapped it against their knee, and it began to sing. The sound was high and clear and singular, a perfect A that filled the workshop with its presence. It wasn't loud, but it was penetrating, that particular frequency that cut through other sounds and announced itself with certainty. The luthier held the fork near the A string, letting the vibrations match, checking by ear whether the string was close to pitch. And then several things happened very quickly. Fiddle's head snapped up. Her ears, which had been relaxed and soft, suddenly swiveled forward and stood at attention. Her pupils dilated, going from sleepy slits to wide black pools in an instant. She stared at the tuning fork with an expression of deep suspicion and offense, as if the fork had personally insulted her ancestors. The luthier, surprised by the sudden reaction, stopped moving. The tuning fork continued its song, vibrating in their hand, its tone beginning to fade, but still audible. Fiddle rose to a crouch, her tail beginning to twitch at the tip. She lowered her front end, wiggling her hindquarters slightly in that way cats do when they're preparing to pounce. and then she began to stalk the tuning fork. She moved in a slow circle around the workbench, eyes locked on the fork, trying to locate the source of the sound. But of course there was nothing to see. The fork looked like an ordinary piece of metal. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the air itself. Fiddle reached out one white paw, toes spread, and swiped at the space near the fork as if trying to catch the invisible vibration. The luthier couldn't help it. They laughed. Really laughed from the belly, the kind of laugh that shook their shoulders and made their eyes water slightly. It had been weeks since they'd laughed like this. Weeks since anything had struck them as genuinely, purely funny. "It's not a bug, Fiddle," they said, still chuckling. "It's just sound." Fiddle sat back, tail twitching in rapid flicks now, clearly disappointed that the invisible enemy had not revealed itself. She maintained her vigilant watch as the fork's tone faded to nothing, and even when silence returned, she continued to stare at it suspiciously for another minute before apparently deciding the threat had passed. The luthier wiped their eyes, set down the tuning fork, and reached instead for the fine tuner's small mechanisms attached to the tailpiece that allowed for minute adjustments to string tension without having to use the pegs. They would use these for the initial tuning, getting the strings close to pitch, and then make final adjustments with the pegs. They plucked the A string gently and turned the fine tuner, bringing the pitch up slowly. The string was far too low at first, producing a dull thud rather than a note. But gradually, as tension increased, a pitch began to emerge. The string started to sing, just barely, just enough to suggest what it would sound like when properly tensioned. The luthier continued, moving from string to string, bringing each one up slowly toward its proper pitch. This had to be done carefully. Too much tension too quickly could damage the soundpost, could warp the bridge, could even crack the top of the instrument if the wood wasn't ready for it. So they worked patiently, a little at a time, allowing the cello to adjust to each increase in tension, listening not just with their ears, but with their hands and the body of the instrument, feeling the vibrations beginning to wake up inside the wood. As the strings came closer to pitch, something remarkable happened. The cello began to resonate. When the luthier plucked one string, the others would sympathetically vibrate, creating a complex web of overtones and harmonics. The wood itself began to sing, no longer dead and silent, but alive with potential, with the kinds of frequencies it had been designed to amplify and transform. The luthier reached for the tuning fork again. Fiddle immediately went on alert, ears forward, body tensing. The luthier smiled, anticipating the performance. They tapped the fork against their knee. It sang out its pure A440. Fiddle launched into action. She crouched, stalked, circled the workbench with exaggerated stealth, her belly low to the surface. When the luthier held the fork near the A string, checking the pitch, Fiddle made her move a quick dart forward, one paw extended, swiping through the air where the sound seemed to be. Her paw met nothing but empty space, and she sat back, looking deeply offended by the whole situation. "Every time," the luthier said, shaking their head with amusement. "You're going to do this every time, aren't you?" Fiddle's tail twitched. Yes, apparently she was. The luthier continued the tuning process, and true to form, every time the tuning fork came out, Fiddle performed her ritual of suspicion and attempted capture. It became a gentle rhythm to the work: tap the fork, check the pitch, adjust the string, suffer Fiddle's dramatic hunt for the invisible enemy, repeat. The luthier found themselves smiling throughout, their chest feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Sometimes the things that help us find our pitch seem strange to others, the luthier thought. Sometimes we have to look silly in the process of tuning ourselves. That's okay. That's just part of it. The strings gradually came up to pitch, each one settling into its proper note. The luthier worked each peg now, turning carefully, pushing in to create the friction that would hold the tension. The pegs creaked, that particular sound of wood on wood, of aged maple finding its grip. They adjusted the bridge position minutely, making sure it stood exactly where it should, perpendicular to the top of the cello, centered and balanced. And still the strings weren't quite right. They never were, not immediately. New strings stretched. They settled. They needed time to find their voice. The luthier tuned and retuned, bringing each string back up as it dropped, patient with the process, understanding that this was just how it worked. Tuning wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing conversation between player and instrument, between tension and release, between what was and what should be. Just like living, the luthier thought, just like being human, we drift out of tune. We need adjustment. There's no shame in that. It's not failure, it's just the nature of things that are alive and subject to change. They thought about their own life, their own slow drift into silence and exhaustion. How they'd stopped singing in the car, stopped calling friends, stopped making real food and eating real meals at a real table. How they'd let themselves slip, string by string, into a kind of muted existence where they functioned but didn't sing. But drift wasn't permanent. With attention, with care, with the right tools and patience, things could be brought back into tune. You just had to be willing to do the work. You had to be willing to turn the pegs even when they stuck, even when it took time, even when you had to do it over and over again, because that's just how tuning worked. The luthier reached for the bow next. It had been waiting in its slot in the case, and they lifted it out carefully. A cello bow was a substantial thing longer and heavier than a violin bow, designed to draw sound from thicker strings to create the deep resonances that made a cello a cello. This bow was old too, though not as old as the cello itself. The stick was Pernambuco wood, dense and slightly orange in color, with a beautiful straight grain. The frog, the ebony piece at the base where the player's zeon rested, was inlaid with a thin strip of mother-of-pearl that caught the light. The bow hair was loose, hanging in a gentle arc between the tip and the frog. That was how bows should be stored with no tension, allowing the stick to rest in its natural curve. But before the bow could be used, the hair needed to be tightened, and it needed rosin. The luthier turned the screw at the end of the bow, and the frog began to slide up the stick, creating tension. The hair straightened, becoming taut, and the stick developed its proper camber, that slight curve that allowed the hair to meet the string at the right angle. Not too tight over-tightening could warp the stick permanently, but tight enough for proper playing. Now for the rosin. The luthier selected a cake from their collection. This one was dark amber, a recipe designed for cello bows, slightly stickier than violin rosin, with more grip. They held the bow in one hand and drew the rosin along the hair in long, steady strokes. Immediately, fine dust began to appear, coating the hair, catching the light. The smell of rosin filled the air, that distinctive scent, like pine and honey, mixed together, sweet and sharp at the same time. The luthier continued rosining, turning the bow to get all sides of the hair evenly coated. The rosin dust fell like fine snow, landing on the workbench, catching in the lamplight in tiny golden motes. It was beautiful in an incidental way, this dust, this byproduct of preparation. Beautiful without trying to be. When the bow was properly prepared, the luthier set it down and returned their attention to the cello. All 4 strings were as close to pitch as they could get for now. The bridge stood properly. The sound post was positioned correctly. Everything was ready. But the luthier found themselves hesitating. This was the moment the first true sound this instrument would make in 37 years. The first time someone would ask it to sing since arthritis had silenced its player and it had been closed into darkness. What if it didn't sing? What if something was wrong that they hadn't caught? What if the voice was damaged beyond repair, the wood too old, the silence too long? But then the luthier realized this was exactly the kind of thinking that had kept them silent too. The fear that if they tried to sing literally or metaphorically, nothing would come out, or what came out would be wrong, broken, not good enough. So it was easier to stay silent, easier not to try. Except silence wasn't easier, it wasn't safer. It was just slow suffocation. The luthier took a breath and reached for the cello. They lifted it carefully and, for the first time, positioned it properly, the body resting on their knees, the neck rising past their shoulder, their left hand on the fingerboard, their right hand holding the bow. This was how it was meant to be held. This was how it was designed to be played. Not lying on a bench, not sitting in a case, but here cradled between human knees, touching human hands, ready to transform the movement of horsehair across metal strings into sound, into music, into voice. The luthier raised the bow and placed it on the C string, the lowest, the deepest, the foundation of everything. They took another breath, steadied their hand, and drew the bow across the string. The sound that emerged was extraordinary. It started as a note, a low C, resonant and full, but it was more than that. It was the voice of the wood itself, of the spruce top vibrating in complex patterns of the maple back, reflecting and amplifying of the soundpost, carrying vibrations between them of the air inside the body, moving and resonating of the bridge trembling, and the bass bar humming, and all the invisible architecture of the instrument doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The note was deep, it was warm. It filled the workshop like something with physical presence, like amber honey light made audible, like the feeling of being held. It resonated not just in the air, but in the workbench and the floor, in the luthier's chest where their sternum touched the back of the cello. But more than all of that, there was something else. The luthier felt it through their hands, through their body, through some sense that had nothing to do with hearing. The cello itself responded to the note it was making. The wood, which had been silent for 37 years, seemed to sigh with relief, with gratitude, with the profound satisfaction of being asked to do, once again, the thing it was made to do. The luthier held the note, keeping the bow moving steadily, and felt tears prick at the corners of their eyes. This was why they did this work. This was why their grandmother had taught them, and why her father had taught her. Because instruments weren't just objects. They were voices waiting to be heard. They were songs waiting to be sung. And sometimes those songs needed someone to care enough to wake them up, to tune them, to give them permission to sound again. The luthier lifted the bow and the note ended, but its resonance continued for a moment, hanging in the air, fading slowly into silence. A good silence this time. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of rest between notes, the silence that gave meaning to sound. They played a scale, just 8 notes, nothing fancy, nothing complicated. C, D, E flat, F, G, a flat, B flat, C, up and back down again. The cello sang each note beautifully, its voice growing warmer as the wood woke up fully, as the strings settled into their work, as the entire instrument remembered what it was for. Fiddle, who had been watching from the corner of the workbench, made a small chirping sound, not quite a meow, but a vocalization of what might have been approval or might have been commentary, or might have been nothing more than acknowledgement that something significant had happened. She stood, stretched, and then curled up again, tucking her paws beneath her chest, her purring audible even over the final fading notes of the scale. The luthier set the bow down and simply held the cello for a moment, feeling its weight, its warmth, its presence. They understood now what they'd been trying to tell themselves all evening, what the work had been teaching them while their hands were busy and their mind was quiet. They'd been like this cello, fundamentally sound, well made, but out of tune from being silent too long, from being left in the case while life happened around them, from being ignored and neglected, even though the capacity for music was still there had always been. There was just waiting for someone to care enough to do the work of restoration, and the someone who needed to care was themselves. They needed to tune themselves the way they tuned this instrument, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that tuning wasn't a one-time event but an ongoing practice, something you came back to again and again because drift was natural and adjustment was necessary, and there was no shame in needing to be brought back into pitch. They needed to clean away the dust and grime of exhaustion and neglect. They needed to tighten the strings that had gone slack, the connections to friends, the practices of self-care, the small joys they'd stopped allowing themselves. They needed to adjust their sound post, those invisible internal supports that made everything else work. They needed to apply rosin to their bow and draw it across their own strings and see what sound emerged. And maybe, probably, it would be rusty at first, out of tune. The pegs would stick. The voice would be uncertain. That was okay. That was just the beginning of the process. With time and care and patience, the voice would return. The song would come back. The instrument would remember what it was made for. The luthier carefully set the cello on its stand, a padded rack designed to hold it safely. Strings up, ready for tomorrow's playing when the new strings would have stretched and settled and would need tuning again. They switched off all the lamps except one, leaving just enough light to navigate the stairs. Fiddle jumped down from the workbench and padded to the stairs, waiting. The luthier followed, pausing at the bottom to look back at the workshop one more time. The cello stood on its rack, glowing amber in a single lamp's light, its strings catching tiny gleams, its voice waiting. Not silent anymore, not forgotten, just resting. Tomorrow, the luthier decided, they would call their friend, the one they'd been meaning to call for months. They would schedule that appointment they'd been avoiding. They would make real food for dinner and sit at the table to eat it. They would take out their own violin and see if it still remembered how to sing under their fingers. They would tune themselves patiently and carefully, understanding that it would take time, that they would drift and need adjustment again, that this was okay, that this was just how living things worked. We all got a little out of tune when we'd been silent for too long, when we'd been overwhelmed, when we'd forgotten to pay attention to ourselves. It didn't mean we were broken. It just meant we needed gentle hands and the right tools and patience and the willingness to do the work. The luthier climbed the stairs, Fiddle's small warm presence just ahead in the darkness. Behind them, the workshop settled into its nighttime quiet, but it was a different quiet now than it had been when they descended those stairs hours before. It was the quiet of work completed, of voices restored, of strings holding their tension and waiting, ready for tomorrow's song. Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming the world into something clean and new. Inside, the old house creaked and settled. The radiators hissed their gentle lullabies, and in the basement workshop, a cello that had been silent for 37 years stood ready to sing again, its wood still humming faintly with the memory of that first deep note, that sigh of relief, that sound of coming home to itself. We all carry instruments inside ourselves, the luthier thought as they reached the top of the stairs. Hearts that need tuning, voices that need encouragement, strings that need the right tension to sing, and sometimes the luthier we're waiting for is ourselves, our own gentle hands, our own patience, our own willingness to do the slow work of restoration, to polish away the dust, to tighten what's loose and loosen what's tight, to find the note that's been waiting inside us all along. If this quiet restoration has resonated with you, if these words have found you in your own moment of needing to be tuned, please consider showing your support with a like. Subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more peaceful nights and gentle journeys into rest. We're all instruments waiting to remember our song. We're all wood and strings and possibility, waiting for the patience and care that reminds us we were made to sing. Sleep well. Tomorrow we tune again,